I want to first start to thank Chris and the Center for Growth and Opportunity. What a great idea to do a conference like this. Bartlett, who Chris just mentioned, and I have tried to organize tech panels during the State Policy Network annual meeting, and we've done that over the years, but to have a whole day conference focus on tech policy is fantastic. So I know it's part of SPN or one of the pre-conferences. So I just want to compliment the Center for Growth and Opportunity and Chris for putting this conference together. This is a great turnout for the first event. And we're really encouraged to see this many people here that are part of the SPN meeting that are interested in tech and telecom policy. As Chris mentioned, I'm with the Washington Policy Center. We're the state think tank in Washington State. We appreciate you focusing on the state groups. Great to have Annette from Minnesota talking today. And I know our friends at James Madison Institute in Florida are speaking a little bit later. So as Chris said, this panel is going to focus on 5G and broadband deployment and focusing really on state policy. So much, I think the perception at least, is that all tech and telecom is focused on federal policy. There's no role for state think tanks, and that's part of our goal at ALEC and Washington Policy Center and State Policy Network is to showcase that actually a lot of the decisions are being made at the state level, and that state think tanks do need to engage. And a lot of these issues are your traditional bread and butter tax regulatory issues, and you don't need to be a high-tech expert. You can weigh in on these issues based on your work on tax and regulatory reform policy. So that's part of our goal. Chris mentioned our tech exchange. So if you want to get on that list, it's a very simple newsletter. There's a sample of it that was handed out when you checked in, so it's in your packet. It comes out every month. We're always looking for new story ideas. But if you give me your business card or email me, we can add you to our monthly list. And then Bartlett and I have resurrected the State Policy Network ALEC conference calls. So we're trying to, again, get state think tanks engaged on state issues when it comes to tech. So we held our first one in August, and our next one is actually next Wednesday, the 17th. So we're going to be covering some of these state tech issues we're talking about today with state think tanks. So I encourage all of you to get on our list and be part of our call next Wednesday, October 17th. We have a great panel. I'll jump right in and introduce the panelists. Brent Skorup will go first. Brent is a senior research fellow in technology policy program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He's also on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee and vice chair of the Competitive Access Subcommittee. He's a member of the Arlington, Virginia Broadband Advisory Committee and the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project. Second, we'll hear from David Don. He's the Vice President of Regulatory Policy at Comcast. He's also a member of the Federal Communications Bar Association. And prior to that, he practiced communications law at Wilkie, Farr, and Gallagher. Our third speaker will be Tom Struble. Tom's the Tech Policy Manager at R Street Institute. He's the member of the, also member of the Moot Court Board. Prior to R Street, he was the Policy Counsel at TechFreedom, a law clerk for the Competitive Carriers Association, and he also worked on the mobility issues, FCC Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. And our final speaker will be Graham Owens. Graham is a legal fellow at TechFreedom. He previously worked as a law clerk in the House Oversight Committee and the Federal Trade Commission's Bureau of Consumer Protection. And I love his resume. He says that his main goal is endlessly trying to figure out what constitutes reasonable. Thought that was a great summary of all tech policy. So we have a great panel. We're also going to be kind of previewing two brand new studies. So Tom Struble has a sneak peek at their broadband scorecard. It's a unique scorecard looking at all the states, how they rank on broadband deployment. And then Graham Owens' new study was in your packet as well, and so he'll be talking about that. So we're excited to have all of you with us, but also kind of previewing 2 new state tech policies. So let's start with Brent.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me at this beautiful venue. So I'm going to lay the groundwork a little bit about why states and localities are increasingly important when it comes to technology and broadband infrastructure. And I'd like to back up for one moment and just talk about why I really enjoy tech and telecom policy, and why I'm glad to see states and localities and others taking an interest in this. A few months ago, Pew surveyed Americans and asked them, what's the area in American life that's improved most in the last 50 years? And by a huge plurality, people said technology was the biggest improvement in American life in the last 50 years. A distant second was healthcare, and a lot of that healthcare improvement, I think, was technology as well. And then down the list were things like the environment and civil rights and other things. But all that to say, technology is a liberating force for people. It improves our lives immensely, and people are recognizing it. And it should be a priority for states. It's often thought as a federal issue, but increasingly it's a state issue. And the reason it's increasingly a state and local issue is because of 5G networks and wireless networks that I expect a few of us will talk about. And 5G is, in short, it's wireless networks that give much more capacity, more reliability, much more, allows for real-time services in ways that current cellular networks don't. And states and localities are involved because a major aspect of 5G is what's called network densification. And that means putting a lot of so-called small cells throughout downtown areas. And that means digging up streets, attaching to city poles and telephone poles. It means permitting, it means fees, and a lot of these things the cellular industry has not dealt with quite as much. And this means, cellular also means wired. You need a wired backhaul, and more fiber in the ground, more fiber on poles is a big part of that. And when we talk about, I think Sam said in the last panel, it's easier to say what not to do than what to do. Now, I'll give one extreme example of what not to do in a related area. AT&T was upgrading their UVerse television system in San Francisco about 10 years ago, and they ran into all these zoning requirements to replace their boxes on sidewalks. They fought with local zoners for a few years, and then they fought with local activists for beautification reasons for several years, and it prevented, I think it was 7 years, an entrant. AT&T at the time was not a big TV provider, prevented an entrant from entering the market for several years. And so that's what we don't want to see when it comes to small cells and 5G technology. And on 5G, it's more than fast cat videos or faster YouTube videos. 5G will hopefully, it's hard to say. Predicting the future is always hard, but like I said, it's more reliability, more real-time services, and higher capacity. You can do things that you can't do with today's network. And I'll give a couple of examples of applications that are out there, but no one's quite figured out what the killer app will be. But one is, so self-driving cars will not rely, I don't expect they'll rely exclusively on networks to function. However, networks will be an important complement to them. There's a few companies out there for autonomous vehicles who, when the autonomous car gets in an edge case, it's a very tricky situation that the in-car computer can't handle, it phones back to a remote driver, hundreds of miles away potentially, and they do this via an off-the-shelf 4G LTE system that we have in our phones right now. With 5G, you just get much more reliability, less latency, a more responsive network, and I think for all of us who will be on the roads with these, you want that responsiveness. Another application that's out there, just to kind of show, so there's mass market, there are also niche services that will come about. There's this company called IRA, and they make smart glasses for blind people and the visually impaired. And you wear these glasses, there's a camera attached to it that's always scanning the environment, and via 4G LTE today, it's sending the video back to a remote assistant who is narrating in real time what that blind person is seeing. And there's some cool videos online you can find of people using this application. You buy buckets of minutes per month, much like old cell phone plans, but if they need assistance at the airport, for instance, it's a common application. It gives them more confidence to get around an airport. They can, person using this can go to the grocery store and find fresh produce. They can have menus read to them. And for the blind community, it's important new technology that 5G will improve what's already out there. And so these are a few things, aside from what we all foresee, which will be, you can possibly cut the cable, sorry David, and go wireless only for broadband. You could have TV via wireless, and those are important things, but it's more than niche applications. The applications we can't envision right now that will be really remarkable. So all that to say, this is very important technology. Increasingly, telecom and wireless companies need local permission to go on the rights of way, to go on roadsides, to attach to city poles, and fees and regulatory processes are a huge factor in how quickly these get deployed and the coverage, how many people they cover with that.
That's great. Good. That's a great. I wanted people to learn about what is 5G before we jump in. We shouldn't assume everyone even knows what 5G is. They've heard about it, but that's a great explanation of what it is and more importantly, why it matters, why it's important to people's lives. So with that, let's go to David Don from Comcast.
Great. First, I'd like to reserve 30 seconds to rebut the wireless cord cutting before at the end of my time here. So why is the Comcast guy here on the 5G panel? Hopefully I can give a little more context and bring it around to why cable and the wireline industry cares so much. On 5G, I think Brent gave you a good perspective, but let me see if we can dig a little bit deeper in here and why the cable guy is here. The public policy issue for 5G, there really are two, and on this panel I think we'll focus on one. One is one that we've been having for many years, what the wireless industry loves to do, is pursue more spectrum. I think all of us have probably sat on spectrum panels before, and there's a major 5G agenda at the federal level, and that is purely a federal issue about spectrum. But there's another issue on 5G that the wireless industry started about 3 or 4 years ago that goes really to fundamentally not just about 5G, but the deployment of new telecommunications services that depend on the access to the public rights of way. And what role should our local governments have in managing those access to the public rights of way? And that's a debate that's not just a 5G debate. It's a debate the cable industry has been in for about 50 years and is very much involved in now. And it's a debate that the electric companies started 100 years ago when they were building their networks. And so the question the wireless industry started when the engineers developed 5G technology, and Brent mentioned densification of their network, is they said over the last 20 years, the wireless industry has built probably one of the greatest wireless networks in the world on private property. Those big towers you see are permitted, of course, but they're largely built on private property through private negotiations. The engineers came by and said, we got a great idea. You've built 100,000 of these cell sites, they're great, but with 5G, we're gonna need about 1 million of these sites. And we're gonna need them about 100 to 200 to 300 feet from the user. So the company said, well, how are we going to build this? And they realized quickly that they're going to have to build these boxes in the public rights of way. And when they looked and said, well, how do we get in the public rights of way? They said, we see how the utilities have done it for a while, and that doesn't seem a good model for us. The cable industry, let's look at their model. Oh, they pay 5% of revenue, and for the cable industry, that's $3 billion a year. For Comcast, it's about $1.5 billion a year to access these public rights of way, which essentially amount as a tax on consumers and on broadband services. So the wireless industry said, we need to come up with a new model. And they've gone to the various forms, right? So they go to municipalities to privately negotiate access, and some municipalities are much more favorable than others. Actually, I should say few municipalities were more favorable than others. They then went to the states, and they got about 20 states to issue a statewide system of access to the rights of way. And they're pursuing it at the federal level, including at the FCC, where just several weeks ago they got the FCC to issue an order that establishes certain basic parameters for how municipalities should regulate the rights of way for these 5G small cells. And I'm not going to get, well, let's see, some of their key issues are reviewing applications. Has to be done, the states and the FCC have issued what would be reasonable timelines of 60 to 90 days, essentially, to review an application to deploy broadband or 5G facilities. The fees have got to be reasonable and cost-based. We definitely, and the FCC actually said, we don't think 5% is probably reasonable, 5% of revenue. And I'm like, wait a second, that's what I pay. How is this not reasonable? We're in this for $3 billion a year, every year, to subsidize a lot of these local communities. So why is the cable guy here? Because the wireless industry has started a very important discussion as a public policy matter, and then I'll tell you as a business matter why we're here. We think we need to be talking about how the local governments are managing these rights away, and do we believe these should be profit centers that are really just taxes on their own community, but instead of looking like a tax that the policymaker and the politicians are liable for, they pass these fees on to the entities that are using the rights of way, and these quasi-utility type of entities, whether it's a cable company or a phone company. So it looks like it's fees we're imposing. We know how the cable industry gets blamed for a lot of these fees, and some of them are our responsibility, of course, and some are because of these fees we pass through. So these are essentially taxes, and the wireless industry has started a big discussion that I think all of us in this room should be talking about and writing about, and the FCC has obviously engaged heavily in this discussion, which is what is the appropriate mechanism for a company to access the rights of way? What are the fees and processes associated with these? Because all of these are barriers for the citizenry to get broadband any quicker, and that applies whether it's a cable company or a wireless company. But secondly, why am I here? Because 5G, and this is where I'm going to go to my 30 seconds on Brent, where he says wireless only is an option in cord cutting. It turns out 5G is not particularly different, and I see Nathan back there, and I don't want to discourage all the hype and excitement around 5G, but a lot of what the cable industry has done resembles the architecture of what the 5G guys are going to do. I just said they're going to go from big cell towers that cover a 5-mile radius, let's say, to small cell sites on the light pole that's going to cover a 100-foot, 200-foot radius. Well, guess what? I already have a wire going down all these poles, as you know. These are the rights of way. These are the fees I've been paying. And then what do I do? From the light pole, I run one more wire to the home generally, or to a business. Let's call that 50 feet. And then inside the home, what am I using? Wireless. 99.9% of our customers are using Wi-Fi around the home. Right? So it's a big wire. We have a big fat fiber going down to a node on the corner. From that fiber, we might run coax or more fiber down the pole, and then we run a coax off the pole into the home. If you look at Verizon's deployment of 5G right now in Sacramento, there's fiber all the way from the backhaul, fiber to the pole, and all they're doing at the pole is substituting my drop, what we call a drop, that coax line, substituting it with a radio. And then in the home, it's a Wi-Fi radio like my radio, I think, a lot of times. So the architecture looks very similar and, unfortunately for Brent, heavily dependent on these wires. So our position is when we're looking at streamlining broadband deployment policies, it shouldn't be 5G focused. It shouldn't be if you're just deploying a radio box on the light pole, you get your 60-day approval, you pay $20 or $50 or $100. It should be if you're deploying broadband in the rights of way, your permits should be approved quickly, your fees should be reasonable and cost-based, and we should be having a broader discussion. Some of this will require change in legislation and things like that, but fundamentally, it's the same thing. It's broadband deployment and removing barriers to broadband deployment, wireline or wireless.
That's great. Good explanation of the common threads between wireless and wireline. That's great. All right, so let's now move to Tom Struble from R Street and talk about this new broadband scorecard you have.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And yeah, so my presentation will marry a lot of what Brent and David have said because it touches on both wireless and wireline. But so as we alluded to earlier, R Street has been working on a broadband scorecard project that rates all the individual states on their broadband laws. There's about 40-some criteria for each of the states, 50 states, 2,000 plus data. It's a giant data set. It'll be out later this month or the first week of November. I forget when our final launch date is slated for. But we have most of the data compiled already, so I'm going to, I guess, first explain briefly the methodology of what we're looking at, and then list a few interesting anecdotes that I think tie in well with discussions already had. So first, a broadband scorecard. What are we doing? What are we looking at and what are we rating? We think about it from the perspective of a businessman. If you're an incumbent telco or cable provider or wireless provider, or if you're a new entrant wanting to get into the broadband market, what do you have to do? Whose permission do you need? What are the barriers to entry or barriers to your market participation? Outside of private barriers, you need access to capital and technology, but what are the government barriers standing in your way? Whose permission do you need? And unfortunately, there are several barriers standing in your way. You generally have to go to the state and get state-level approval to act as a business offering telecom services in that state. Could be a cable franchise, could be a telecom franchise, but generally you need state-level approval. Then you also need to go to the individual cities and to go and get zoning authority. Sometimes that comes with a local franchising authority where franchising is done at the local level rather than the state level, but you got to go to the locality and get general access to enter the rights of way. So general operations, general rights of way, and then also for each individual thing you want to do, you got to get a construction permit. So there are at least 3 major barriers that we looked at, and around each of those, there are various things that states can do to make them less burdensome and expedite that process. And they're mainly things we've already talked about, like lowering fees. Are your fees reasonable and cost-based? Are they non-discriminatory? How long does it take? Because time is money. Are there shot clocks on your decision-making? Is there a deemed granted remedy with the shot clock, where if they don't act in time, can you go ahead, or do you have to go to court and sue to try and get permission? So these are things that we looked at, and so tying back to the 5G wireline wireless discussion, as David mentioned, 5G, it's a great branding effort by the wireless industry. A lot of people are excited about it, myself included. I think it's going to be really great. But it is, in a sense, a sort of marketing campaign because you're trying to convince state legislators to do something. Brent, mentioned earlier that a lot of these, when we're talking about what to do, it's usually what not to do. But sort of counterintuitively here, to liberate the broadband market and make it more competitive and open, we need state legislators to act and step in and actually pass laws. Because if they don't, then you're either leaving it up to the state PUC, and maybe they'll do a good job, maybe they won't. But as we see at the federal level with Congress and the FCC, sometimes the FCC is doing a really good job. They're doing, great, small cell orders, but they also went down the Title II net neutrality route a couple years ago. So we can't really trust the FCC or any regulatory body to do what's right all the time, because at the end of the day, they're subject to the whims of the politicians who, obviously, it changes over time. So like at the federal level, we're asking for Congress to pass more legislation, not just leave it all to the FCC. We're also asking state legislators to pass laws and not leave it up to their state PUCs, or even more troublingly, just leave it up to the counties or the cities to do whatever they want. And you have a lot of states that have passed almost no laws at the state level, so it's entirely up to the cities or counties to decide what they want to charge for rights-of-way access or for pole attachments and how long they want to take. So getting into some of the specific details, the 5G effort, we have now 21 states that have passed small cell bills, including Utah, passed one in March of this year, went into effect September 1st. There are still bills pending in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and there were 6 other bills introduced this year that failed. But generally, states have been getting the message that wireless future, you need to have these specific small cell bills because all the laws on the books are designed for macro towers, if they have any laws on the books at all. So states are getting the message there and updating their laws to reflect these need to deploy small cells. Like I said, 21 have passed small cell bills. In 29 states, fees for accessing rights-of-way are non-discriminatory. So if you're a cable provider or a wireless provider or a telco, you're getting charged the same rate. That's good, because if you're competing in the market and one's being charged a different rate than the other, that's a distortion. That's not good. But only 21 states are those right-of-way fees cost-based. So it's one thing for fees to be non-discriminatory, but if those fees are non-discriminatorily very high, that's still not good. So 21 states have cost-based fees, but only 14 of those states actually have a hard cap on the fees. Ideally, you would have both, a requirement in your law that fees be cost-based and non-discriminatory, but also the best states have a hard cap and say the lesser of the actual costs in processing the permit or this number, which gives you added certainty, and when you're playing a business, that's helpful. So 14 states have a hard cap on that, but then getting into the wireless versus wireline, for example, 21 states currently have a shot clock on co-locations where you're attaching like a small cell to an existing structure. There are 27 states that have shot clocks on that, but only 23 states have a shot clock for if you're deploying a new wireless facility, like a new pole or like a new monopole for a wireless tower or a new utility pole to carry other broadband infrastructure. So more co-location shot clocks than new facility shot clocks. But you compare that to the shot clocks for deploying new wires. Like if you're just doing a typical pole attachment, do you want to string new wires to a pole or upgrade, overlash your existing cables with more? There's only 11 states that have a shot clock on that. So this sort of gets to the, I guess, relative disparity in attention that state legislators are getting all in 5G, but that's only one half of the coin. You need backhaul. You can do wireless backhaul somewhat with microwave links or 3.5 or other options, but generally you need fiber somewhere to get backhaul to the greater internet. And so I think it's great to see progress at the state level in terms of trying to win the race to 5G and get deployment done faster at the state and local level. But it would be, I think, folly to focus only on the wireless side of things because wireline is equally important. And again, we just have to be sort of non-discriminatory in our regulation and not preordain any one business model against any of the others. If the incumbents beat out the new entrants on their own merit, that's great. But if the playing field is tipped one way or the other, that's generally not good policy. But anyway, I'm sure we can get into more of this later, but some interesting opening thoughts.
Great. All right. And our final speaker is Graham Owens. And Graham's going to talk a little bit more about state deployment and his new study that just came out.
Yeah, so the not being discriminatory in regulations is a great segue. So I'm going to take a little bit of a change, and unlike others, I am actually going to talk about what states can do in terms of regulating broadband. So continuing an overarching theme, what is federalism in the 21st century, and what's the balance between states' roles and federal roles in regulating the entirety of the internet, edge services, broadband, what have you. And there are numerous events recently that sort of bring this all to a head. And we've got California's SB 822, which is their net neutrality law. They also passed their state privacy law. And then you also have the FCC's 5G order, which has already been challenged. So 2 of the 3 of those have already been challenged in court. The third is sort of inevitably going to be. And so what this all sort of brings us, what exactly is the background of all this? Talk about the key legal principles that are being discussed, and then starting with what states can't do, because it's important to understand the legal principles saying what they can't do to understand what states can do and why. Background here, I also served on the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee, and I was on the Removing State and Local Barriers Working Group. And one tool that the FCC has is preemption, which is grounded in the Supremacy Clause, but essentially, commerce left to the federal government, and in certain instances where state laws conflict with federal policies or objectives, the FCC and other agencies are able to step in and preempt the states from acting there. So it's not really a question of whether this is a tool, but it became a very hot button issue when we were talking through these, and a lot of states and local governments refused to sort of acknowledge that. So we went from like a 25-page report to basically like a 1-sentence statement that said preemption is a thing. That's like basically all we could get to agree on. So anyway, the focus on my paper is on net neutrality, but the principles that are discussed, particularly the Dormant Commerce Clause, which I'll get to, apply to all regulation of the internet, and that's because of its uniquely interstate nature, right? So starting with preemption, like I said, the FCC has a long history of preempting state laws that conflict with a federal policy of pro-competition and deregulation. I can think going all the way back to 1976, the City of New York v. FCC Supreme Court case in the 80s under the Cable Act. More recently, the Minnesota PUC VoIP cases. So this has been going on far before net neutrality was a thing and far before Title II ever came into existence. So I think a lot of people think, okay, the FCC is starting to get a little ahead of themselves. But this is a long practice they've had to promote growth of these technologies. And it's worked. And it's important too, because you can imagine a hodgepodge or potpourri of 50 or even more if the local governments start doing it, different rules governing how we regulate broadband. You could have one state that says you can do something, another state that specifically says you can't do that thing, or actually you say, the first state you have to do it. Well, now a national provider literally can't comply with both. Either way, they are going to run afoul of one of those states' regulations. So that's sort of where the preemption comes in, and it seems pretty clear why the FCC is able to preempt. They return back to Title I. That was the regulatory regime that existed until 2015, and the FCC on numerous occasions was able to preempt states in certain instances. So I don't really see that that's going to be much of an issue in the net neutrality context. The dormant commerce clause, or the dormant aspect of the commerce clause, is the second piece. And it's sort of, even if the FCC couldn't expressly or hadn't expressly preempted these laws, could the states then regulate it? And it's a little bit trickier, but it's still essentially the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no, in terms of, when I said no, I mean ex ante broad regulations specifically aimed at broadband, ISPs. And the reason that those are also going to be sort of run into trouble under the Dormant Commerce Clause is that the Dormant Commerce Clause was, created by the courts, but it's underlying our entire Constitution, and that states can't get into these discrimination games where they start going after each other, and they can't start regulating in ways that sort of seep over into the borders of another state, or perhaps even further. And so, first and foremost, states have to, they can't regulate any sort of industry that is just inherently interstate and requires uniformity. And we go back to, there's a line of cases, the Wabash Railroad cases, where states were told by this court that, we need this for our economy to move. So we just can't have, Illinois and Indiana and California having all these different requirements, because railroads are going to have to stop, figure out if they're compliant before they can keep going, and just grind to a halt. The interstate system was really next, and then now we're sort of see it in the internet context. Because preemption is such a strong legal doctrine, courts haven't really addressed it, but I think we're going to start seeing it. But the few courts that have made it pretty clear. The interstate is just one of those purely interstate things that has to be sort of roped off from state regulation ex ante, meaning that, regulating prospective potential acts. So that sort of gets us to what can states do. And the good news is they can do a lot. States, both the FTC, long supported all states creating what they're called baby FTC Acts. They're these general laws, or laws of general applicability, consumer protection laws, deception, unfair practices. Those are grounded in sort of common law. ISPs can't come in and promise you one thing and give you another. They can't drive up prices and we find out it's collusion. All of that, states already have the power to regulate and police those activities. They don't need these broad-reaching regulations that sort of reach over where you could again imagine Verizon or whatever organization trying to comply with Alabama saying you can't regulate at all, and then California saying you have to follow these, and you're no-win situation. With these general laws, states are able to get through it because more or less the action is already occurred. So they always have to enforce these retroactively or ex post. And so when they see, say, an ISP acting inappropriately or discriminating or lying, be fraudulent to how they're going to offer their services, when the states come in and enforce those general laws, they can show that there's real harm. They can show that those affected just the people in their states and enforce their law just to the extent it's in their states. And then most importantly, it's non-discriminatory, right? Nobody gets to act fraudulently. Nobody gets to act discriminatorily. So I think it's important that states focus on that. And then also, one thing I haven't seen from states is, urge your members, if you talk to them at the state level, to get to their congressional delegation. Congress could fix this. And I think if every single one of their state legislature got every member of delegate in Congress from California to push this, we wouldn't even have this conversation. So, thank you.
All right, thanks, Graham. Well, that's great discussion. So, nice way to lead into audience questions, but I'll also ask a couple short questions and then you guys think of your questions in a minute. So, I want to get the panel's reaction. Are we going to have 50 different rules when it comes to 5G and broadband, or do you think there is the possibility of having one national system, and what are the pros and cons of 50 versus one?
Sure, I'll jump out by throwing out a plug for Thune and Schatz's legislation, the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act. It would impose shot clocks nationwide on I think at least co-locations, maybe also new wireless facilities deployment. I'm not sure, but it would put, I think, 60 and 90-day shot clocks on small cell review for permitting across the country. I think that would be good to have a uniform framework, but that also looks like it's not going to pass anytime this Congress, and I don't think state legislatures should sit on their hands and wait for Congress to do something bold like that. It would be great, but in the meantime, should do it on their own.
Just so I don't understand your question, are you asking us to predict whether Congress will act on anything? I just want to make sure I understand the question. Right? I mean, at the federal level, we saw the FCC take some bold action. It is going to be subject to extensive litigation, and there will, the FCC, as usual case, wins a little bit and loses a little bit. And what we probably need, both on net neutrality and on infrastructure, is federal legislation that clarifies these issues. Unfortunately, I think
the states are going to have to step in and do their own rules.
that's right. So I think you're going to see the state campaigns on 5G not, and even though the FCC just took sort of a 50-state action, I think the wireless industry in particular is likely to continue their activities at the state level as sort of at a minimum of belts and suspenders. The FCC order will be subject to litigation for the better part of a year. So, and then the outcomes, of course, I think are largely uncertain. So I think there will be state-by-state work on this because I don't think anyone has a lot of confidence that Congress will act on this or in net neutrality.
I'll just
So just 2 points. One, separating infrastructure and net neutrality regulations, we're regulating conduct. States, when they own these poles, they own these buildings. And so that, in a way, is a proprietary action. And there is an exception to preemption and dormant commerce clause when when a state is acting as a market participant, when they own and they're simply contracting like a private citizen would. Now, it gets a little fuzzy, and I won't go into whether, who's going to win there, but it's important to know the distinction between that and regulating, because if you own it, you can act it. And then two, it's also important to realize that, we had a conversation with Scott Wiener, the guy who wrote California's net neutrality bill. The question is not, if Congress doesn't act, that doesn't default to the states, right? These are legal doctrines under the Constitution that even if Congress can't get their act together, it still has to be federal. And that's where I was getting to, collaboration, working between the states and Congress and sort of forcing their hand is the kind of action we need, because I think courts, you will see it over the coming years, courts are going to rule that this is, no matter how lame Congress is, this is just a federal issue.
I'll say on broadband deployment regulation, 50 different authorities would be a big improvement over today. There are countless, there are 30,000 counties and municipalities. Kelly McGriff, who's on the BDAC, he's general counsel for a fiber infrastructure company. He tells a story. In Birmingham, Alabama alone, I think that he needed to receive 40 different contracts from all the municipalities in Birmingham alone just to deploy in that area. So 50 state laws would be a big improvement over today, where there's not much coordination, and that's something states could improve is more coordination about how you can get there. But yeah, on the net neutrality issue, this must be a federal issue. When you're dealing with traffic management, the internet and internet functionality inherently crosses state lines. If you were to email me right now, it might ping somewhere in California and come back to me. So internet, you absolutely need one federal policy, not a bunch of state policies.
Great. All right, and last question from me, Tom. Do you want to just you mentioned 21 states have small cell laws, but maybe just what are the best states, or are there too many to mention? Like in your new scorecard, what states rank at the top of the list, and what can states learn from those top ranking states?
Sure. So yeah, I don't have all the full list in front of me, but as I recall, Arizona, Florida, Kansas, Ohio, I think Indiana, all top 5, or at least top 10. I believe Utah also in the top 10. The states at the bottom of the list, the ones you'd also sort of expect, California, Maryland, Alabama, a lot of states that just haven't done anything and punted it, pass the buck onto the cities and say, oh, you probably know how to do this. And Like in California, for example, we see some of the cities are doing a good job. Like Sacramento got early Verizon 5G deployment because they worked with them to, I assume, reduce barriers and costs. But we also see, San Jose and other cities in California charging, thousands of dollars for pole attachments, not cost-based at all. So, I will implore you all to review the full scorecard and the reports when it is out in a few weeks. For now, a few anecdotal examples there. But pretty much, as I said earlier, it's sort of counterintuitive to the free market conservative movement, but we need government laws here to liberate the market, because right now it is not very free. It's mostly state and local regulators, and going back to the sort of public choice arguments earlier about why they impose these big fees, it's because they can, and they don't take the political hit for it, because ISP is generally not very popular, and people see the high bills, maybe they'll read it closely and see a couple line item things for like, oh, the state universal service fee or all these other fees, but also in some states, nefariously, they prohibit a line item charge on your bills to even show your customers like, hey, I'm charging you an extra $5 this month because the state is forcing me to do it for this broadband deployment program. Anyway.
Yeah, but I think, David, you bring up a good point that these are not just fees that are they just happen and that no one pays them. It really is a tax on local citizens. It's a tax on all of us.
Absolutely, and then they discourage consumption, discourage the build out of broadband, and the higher prices discourage consumption of broadband, and we all know how important broadband is to this country at all levels, right? It's civic engagement, it's commerce, it's education, it's healthcare, it's everything we do nowadays, and for communities to be raising barriers to broadband deployment is insane. One point though, California is, and I'm not here to defend California, that's for sure, their state legislature actually passed a 5G bill that looked a lot like all the other 21s. And it was really, that was the pivotal point where the momentum shifted, because there you got the mayors of the cities and the leaders of the communities to rise up and convince the governor to veto the bill. And that's when you saw a pause in the momentum nationwide that the wireless industry had about 18 months ago or so, a year ago. And that really changed everything. I don't know, though, if the infrastructure question, to Graham's point, is a dormant commerce clause. Obviously, it affects broadband, which is international. But these go to really local governments managing their rights of way, and whether or not they can exercise unfettered monopoly power to raise these prices and then shift the costs onto other companies and hide these taxes from consumers. I'd be interested to know when your next paper comes out how you tie that into the dormant commerce clause, because I think that would be interesting, but it might be a bridge too far.
What's next?
All right, what questions do we have from all of you?
It might be a little practically less possible, but rather than a top-down federal regulation, what about something like an ALEC or like a state best practices bill that if a big state like California adopted it and then some other big states, it just wouldn't make any sense for the smaller states not to adopt a piece of model legislation like that. So is there a piece of model legislation that exists that any of you would say is pretty close, or is anybody working on something like that, or what's the status there?
So you had three of us here from a federal advisory committee that the FCC created last year called the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And one of the subgroups or subcommittees was tasked with developing a state model code. I served on that committee. I don't think anyone else did. So we are almost finalized a state model code. It is somewhat, it's not, well, it's going to be voted on at the next meeting in December. It should be finalized. The issues are, I think, and to be honest, the issues we debated, and I engaged fully in the debate, is whether or not we're going to do a technology-specific bill that says an antenna that's 24 inches by 17, 18 inches has to be approved within 90 days and charged $50, right? Or are we going to have a broader discussion about if you want to deploy broadband and someone submits a permit, like a cable operator or a wireline operator, that permit has to be approved within 90 days and the fee should be cost-based. And it's easier probably to have a narrow, small cell pizza box bill, but I think all of us thought it was important to have a broader discussion about how broadband companies are going to access rights of way and what are the fees and shot clocks and timelines for that. So this state model code tries to tackle a lot of issues. I mean, it has things like fees for railroad crossings. There's a lot of concepts around dig once policies. I'm not sure how much you follow this. So the code tackled a lot of issues. It got contentious, and the way we solved it is, I think we put everything in there, and what we expect is states, because these are state codes, would primarily pick and choose the section that they felt was part of their agenda. So that should be finalized. We've already voted out, I think, 11 out of 12 articles or 12 out of 13 articles. And the last article, which is the small cell specific article, should be voted on December. Do I have that right?
Yeah. I'll just say a quick two things about just discrete things I hope states will do. One, Michigan actually, the Governor Snyder put together a broadband advisory committee at the state level, and they put out a report a few weeks ago, which actually was a pretty strong report. There were some useful recommendations and data and some case studies of what counties were doing, rural counties, to entice broadband providers to come to their area. And there's another issue I'm writing about is giving private property owners more control of their private properties so that they could host low power, small cell equipment on their private property, so that the providers and carriers don't have only one option, which is to go on the public rights of way where there are a lot of issues. This is actually takes inspiration from federal law, which in '96, Congress, because localities and HOAs and landlords were saying customers can't put satellite dishes on their private property because it's an eyesore and you need to pay fees. The FCC prohibited that, and so I take inspiration from that. However, that law does not currently allow you to put transmitters on your private property. You can only put reception, a satellite dish or a fixed wireless receiver. So that's something states can do, and I think it's the proper government to do it.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple more points onto that, because I think it's maybe a bit too full-throated in support of legislation earlier. There are a lot of things that you can be done through soft law, like federal advisory committees, model legislation, form contracts. There's lots of things that groups like ALEC, could do. Obviously, all of our think tanks do a good job, I think, of trying to push out the message. But also, there's an extent to which some of these new broadband issues, maybe we shouldn't adopt a uniform federal framework yet because the whole, laboratories of democracy. Maybe we do want to experiment a bit with some of the, the newer broadband deployment issues, like, small cell deployment. For example, like a lot of states have batch processing. So like if you're deploying 10 or 1,000 small cells, you can file not 1,000 different applications, but some smaller number. But what's the right size of batch? Like, what's too much of an obligation to impose on the city? Because they have to actually look at all these things. They can't just literally rubber stamp them all. So there is still some room, I think, for experimentation at the state and local level. But I do wish we would impose at least some guardrails, some limits on how far they can go in terms of fees, in terms of time limits, things like that.
Great. One last question. Here.
I don't know, this isn't really a question, it's more of a recommendation, but the legislative members of the committees, for example, public utilities from Utah, I don't know that they understand the technical aspects of 5G or other forms of broadband, the regulations that you require or that you'd like to see. I think it would be helpful to just call the members of those committees and maybe give them some information and give them some specifics, things like that. But I don't think it's as tough as you may think to get that done. It's a matter of explanation and some education and helping with the technical part of the legislation. I think that would be very helpful to these states and pinpoint that to those public utility and technology committees.
I think that's a great point. Maybe you guys could comment on that. I think a lot of us, are 50 yards down the field when it comes to 5G, and legislators are way, way down. And that they're talking about healthcare and K-12 education, and they don't even know. They want to sound like they know what 5G is, but they really don't know what it is and how it can benefit their constituents.
I think that's exactly right. I think we in industry and others, it's our job to talk about the benefits of this and hopefully raise it on the priority list. No lawmaker, no city employee wants to stand in the way of progress in these new services, and sometimes they don't have the resources to dive into these things. So no, I think that's right. Education is a big part.
Yeah, I also agree with that. Keeping the theme of soft law, I think outreach to the electric, the other utility people that are in the discussion, because they are also in the public rights of way. Some of the utility poles, they're owned by them. So you think about what's keeping people from passing broadband laws. It's not just that ISPs are unpopular, because everyone still likes broadband. So if you think about who's on the other side of these debates, it's often hard to think about it, but some of the utilities are the ones who are opposing, fee caps, because if they own those, utility poles and they have budgets they got to manage, and you're telling me that I got to start charging a lot less for these fees, then that's impacting my budget. So then that basically caused a lot of friction on the other side of the equation. So yeah, I think outreach from the broadband community to the other PUC participants would be, I think, an effective way to move the ball forward in states where it's currently not.
And I think a cost-effective and easy way to share information with the state is exactly what Michigan did. Do state-level BDACs, where you do broadband deployment discussions and bring in experts within the state from all walks of life, legislation to industry, and have these tough conversations and sit them down at the table. It doesn't cost much, and you can also bring in speaker series. People, I'm sure anyone from the federal level here would be more than happy to come and talk those types of things. And then, sharing that information is incredibly valuable, and I'm sure would help, as Michigan did, help drive the federal discussion.
Yeah, great. Well, we're out of time. I think one of the takeaways for the state groups out there is there's a huge opportunity for the state think tanks and for legislators to show that 5G and broadband deployment is a job creator. That if your state leads and ranks high on this scorecard, you can have a real opportunity to grow and bring jobs to your state. And I also think that, going back to David's point, that policymakers should embrace that and also embrace that this is a way to reduce taxes and fees on citizens. So that's two, I think, big takeaways is what can states do to really be at the forefront of this, that they can now say, as we deploy 5G, that's going to be a job creator and a job grower for our state, and it will reduce the cost of citizens. So please join me in thanking our great panel today.